Lady B back at the studio is doing her darndest to connect us up with Greg Palast. You know, we've spoken to Greg a number of times. He's an author. He's an investigative reporter. He has been spending a lot of time focusing on voter suppression and the Republican efforts to basically keep black people, brown people, poor people, and apparently now we're going to add women to the list from voting. Greg, how are you?
Hey, glad to be with you. I was listening in, so now I'm glad we can speak. Yes. I'm pretty good. I'm just finished doing some calculations, which maybe you don't want to hear.
Uh-oh. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so if you go, for those of you who've been listening to Tom Hartman, Tom Hartman put out a story of mine called Trump Lost, Vote Suppression Won, Here are the Numbers, and here's the bottom line. And by the way, for those of you who don't know Greg Palast, I was you see me in my fedora. Yes, I'm an investigative reporter for BBC Television, the Guardian newspapers, but my day job for decades was as a forensic economist investigator for the U.S. Justice Department and ACLU and other organizations where I do technical work. I'm a numbers guy, and here's the number you need to know. If not for vicious vote suppression, Jim Crow tactics, Kamala Harris would have received another 3,565,000 votes. And she would have won Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia. That would have given her 286 votes. Hail to the chief. But what happened was one of the worst, most biased Jim Crow elections I've ever seen. This is, again, my expertise. Now, this is based on two things. Work I did for the ACLU and the NAACP. And all the numbers I have are actually from U.S. government figures hidden in plain sight, Joan. But you have to understand what happened, okay? Let's start with this. 2,120,000 mail-in ballots were never counted. Like, what? That's not unusual, by the way. According to NPR, by the way, of all places, they did a careful analysis, and I agree with them. 13.8% of mail-in ballots are not counted. All kinds of cockamamie reasons. We're not talking Illinois here. We're talking Mississippi. We're talking Georgia. We're talking Arizona. Okay? If you mail in your ballot, the chance of 1 in 7 your ballot won't be counted. Now, that's over 2 million ballots which were disqualified. Because, Joan, you didn't put your middle initial on the outside of the ballot return
Even
address.
in Illinois, you have to fill out your ballot, make sure everything's signed, you put it in an envelope, and then you have to make sure that the outside of the envelope has your signature. It's kind of,
and it's got to be
kind of confusing.
And, well, it's not just confusing. There's a deliberate attack on voters of color. Just so you know, the state of Washington just did an analysis. And what they found, this is the state of Washington. This ain't Greg Palast. The state of Washington. They found that if you're black, the chance your mail-in ballot will be disqualified is 400% higher than if you are white. 400% higher. Now think of that 2 million number. Now here's another one. Again, not from Greg Palast, but from the United States Civil Rights Commission, which did an analysis. Whose ballot gets rejected? The answer is that if you are black, the chance your ballot will be disqualified for picayune grounds, like someone didn't like your signature, it's 900% higher if you're black than if you're white. So your chance of getting your ballot rejected for a technical reason is 900% higher if you're black than if you're white. That's the U.S. government statistic. Provisional ballots. It's another thing. And again, so it's racial, it's biased, and by the way, a lot of the rejections are of young people. We'll get into that. They're also voters of color. It's blue, despite some of the shifts. Provisional ballots. These are what I call placebo ballots. They make you think you voted, but you haven't. You go in and you vote. You don't have such a problem in Illinois. But believe me, in Georgia, where I was almost the entire election season, you show up, your name is missing from the voter rolls. You've been purged. You've been challenged. We'll get to that. And the little nice lady behind the desk says, hey, here, just fill out this paper ballot, stick it in an envelope, write your information. They'll check your registration. They'll count your ballot. No, they won't. Joan, they don't. And according to the United States Elections Assistance Commission, that's our official agency which tracks not only the vote, but the votes we don't count. They have said, the United States government measured that 42.3%, that's nearly half of all provisional ballots, are thrown in the dumpster. Thrown in the dumpster. That's 1,216,000 ballots, which are thrown in the garbage, electoral garbage. Now, who gets those ballots? According, again, to the U.S. government, if you're black, Hispanic, or Asian American, the chance you will be given one of these provisional ballots, half of which will be thrown away, 300% higher if you're a voter of color than if you're white. That's just the beginning. Purge voters. Now, here's the number, big one. According to the United States Elections Assistance Commission, you'll have, by the way, you don't have to have your calculator or take shorthand notes. It's at gregpalast.com or Tom Hartman report where you get these numbers. Here's the official number from the United States Elections Commission, which is 4,776,706 voters were removed from the voter rolls without evidence that they are wrongful voters. 4,776,706 voters. That's the official U.S. government number. Now, Joan, I'll just give you another, and then I'll tell you why. I actually went through the list in Georgia for the ACLU of Georgia. And I brought in the experts from Amazon. They know where you live, Joan. You've never gotten someone else's tidy-whities, right? So Amazon knows where you live, and so does the U.S. Postal Service. We worked with the Post Office and Amazon's experts, and we literally went through every single name purged from the voter rolls of Georgia. And in that state alone, they gave us back a list, not a sample, but an actual list of the names and addresses of 198,000 voters that were wrongly removed from the voter rolls, saying they had moved and they never moved. 198,000 voters. And we called 800. If you're a statistician, you know, I got my degree in statistics from your dear University of Chicago in economics. And I taught statistics at Indiana U, by the way. I can tell you we called 800 people. So, I'm trying to forget that memory. 800 people who... and it was overwhelmingly African-American voters who were knocked off lists, and some young people who are also voters of color, blue. And including, by the way, you'll see in my film, Vigilantes, Inc., which I've also put out, you'll see a 92-year-old black woman voting at the same voting station 50 years, and Christine Jordan's her name. I happened to be at the Atlanta polling station when she was thrown out with her walker because they said she doesn't live in Atlanta anymore. I went to her house down the street. In the house they said she didn't live in anymore. She was knocked off by the Republican Party officials. And there on the wall was a picture of her having dinner at that house with Martin Luther King, her cousin, 50 years earlier. So if they can knock off Martin Luther King's cousin, these are the people they're knocking off. And finally, the worst, there's other Jim Crow tricks, but the worst of all, Joe, which was brand new this year on a national level. For the first time since 1946, individual vigilante vote hunters knocked off hundreds of thousands of voters, specifically one group, True the Vote, which is a Trump front group. They're the guys that came up with that wacko film 2,000 Mules, which Trump launched at Mar-a-Lago, saying that black men stuff ballot boxes. That accusation. They challenged by August, this is their own number, 317,886 voters. Now, who are these people? They're not government officials. They're Republican Party officials who, under 24 states' Jim Crow laws, you don't have this in Illinois, under 24 states' old Jim Crow laws left on the books, an individual can challenge another individual's right to vote. I can say, don't let Joan Esposito vote because she doesn't live in Illinois. Don't let her vote. Don't count her ballot. But what's worse is that they took Jim Crow to cyberspace. So you have one woman who I confronted. She personally, a GOP official who works for Marjorie Taylor Greene, and this GOP operative, again, not a government official, personally challenged the voting rights of 32,000 of her neighbors. And I showed her the pictures of the black people she challenged, and I said, do you know these people? No. But you challenged their right to vote. Did you call them? No. She said, I can't call 32,000 people, but you could challenge 32,000 people right to vote. And then finally, and one of the other people challenged. Major Gamaliel Turner lives in Columbus, Georgia. U.S. career military. He was challenged by the chairman of the Republican Party in his county, his right to vote, because he was assigned from Fort Benning, Georgia, to a base in California. And they said, okay, well, he doesn't live in Georgia anymore. He can't vote. Do I have to tell you that he's an African-American military man, career military man? And they challenged his right to vote. He calls up and he says, where's my ballot? He calls up from California to his county clerk. And they say, oh, Mr. Turner, you've been challenged. Just come on in. And he says, wait a minute. 2 days before an election, you're telling me to come? All I have to do is fly 2,700 miles and prove I'm a citizen again? Well, by the way, he did fly 5,000 miles round trip to get his ballot counted. Mark Elias, the voting rights attorney, flew down from Washington. He had to go to federal court with Mark Elias, the big shot attorney, to get his one vote counted. This guy challenged 4,000 people, this vigilante Republican operative, challenged 4,000 voters. Only one, Major Turner, because he flew 5,000 miles, got his vote back. That cost, and their game was to go up to, they were proudly announcing, the GOP operatives, that they were aiming at challenging 2 million voters. The NAACP's president in Georgia told me he was looking at 200,000 challenges on Election Day. 200,000
So
challenges.
is this
Tell me you want Georgia.
The secretaries of state who are letting this happen? Is it just the state legislatures who know that they don't want minorities to vote because they want their white Republican butts to stay in power? Who is responsible for this, and what's the most effective way to fight back? I mean, in the next election, should people of color start challenging white Republican voters?
I've talked to Reverend Jesse Jackson. Hey, Reverend, if you're listening, about this, and he and others in the voting rights movement said, if you've ever had your vote taken away from you, you would never do it to anyone else. We don't counter-challenge. We fight this ugly Jim Crow tactic. Now, by the way, this Jim Crow tactic of challenging voters, again, these are not government officials. These are self-appointed vigilantes who in 24 states like Georgia, Florida, unfortunately Pennsylvania, and Michigan allow individuals to challenge anyone else, just say, I don't think that person has the right to vote. And what they're doing is they're literally sending in spreadsheets with thousands of names, a single vigilante. And so we don't counter-challenge. We have to stop this game. But it was originally done in 1946 by the Ku Klux Klan, which mounted a campaign to challenge every black voter in Georgia. They got pretty successful enough to elect a Klansman as governor, Eugene Talmadge. But the feds tried to arrest Talmadge for this scheme, and he drank himself to death literally just before the cops, the FBI, came to arrest him. Now, 1946, we haven't seen it since then. The Trump campaign brought it back. In fact, one of their organizations, the Klan, rebranded itself and incorporated to cover their tracks as Vigilantes Incorporated. That's why my film is called Vigilantes Inc., which, by the way, a little plug because it's free. Leonardo DiCaprio and Jamie Foxx have made it available at no cost. Thank you, guys. And you can get that at gregpalast.com and just stream it for free. But this has not been done since 1946 by the Klan, except what's worse, they've moved from white sheets, where they had to fill out all these forms, to spreadsheets. They're literally just taking lists from this Texas Trump front group, True the Vote, which will give you which will give their GOP operatives challenge lists. And again, we were looking at hundreds of thousands of challenges, and it was barely covered in the U.S. press. But I did the calculations. This is what I do. By the way, I've been going to federal. Was and will be returning again for Rainbow Push and the Reverend Jackson NAACP and probably with the ACLU and others, again, to go into federal court to present these numbers and all the backup, which I can't do in a few minutes here. But it is ugly. What we had was a Jim Crow election. And I'm not talking, Joan, about Elon Musk changing the voting machines from outer space. These are hard numbers from the government's own stats. Not pleasant.
Not pleasant at all. Why do you think this didn't get more coverage in the media?
Because, well, I mean, you heard Joe Biden. I don't want to make fun of people who are cognitively impaired, but he says anyone who challenges the wonder of our U.S. elections is undermining democracy. No, Joe, people use the KKK plan to knock off black voters. Now that, when you take away Major Turner's vote, the guy who took away Major Turner's vote, this vigilante, who, by the way, if you see the film, he actually dresses like a vigilante with his pearl-handled six-gun loaded.
Oh, great.
So the guy with the pearl-handled six-gun, the GOP operative who knocked off thousands of soldiers, black soldiers' votes, now that's the guy who's a threat to democracy. So basically the voting rights groups, in fact, I was just in Chicago. I'll be returning to Chicago in a couple weeks to get together with Reverend Jackson, where we could plan a campaign to challenge the challengers. I was just talking with the great Lawrence Lessig, Harvard law professor. He's putting on his legal guns to take these guys on. The NAACP of Georgia. So you have groups who are on the front lines. Black Voters Matter Fund, very, very valuable group. They are taking these guys on. You have to do it in the courtroom. You have to do it in the streets. And you have to take action to let people – one of the biggest things we did, one of the reasons Joe Biden won Georgia in 2020 is that working with all these groups, we notified – we went to federal court. But most important, we grabbed we got at least 100,000 people back on the voter rolls in 2020. Otherwise, Biden would not have been president because the Black Voters Matter sent out 80,000 postcards to people who were purged. Southwest Voter Education Project spoke to made 150,000 phone calls to Latinos in Spanish and English to say, you got to re-register. They're taking away your vote. So we have to do this on the ground. There's no easy – we have to reform our voting rights movement. We got to take these guys on. Look, in Illinois was the center of the fight against a purge program, which I exposed for Rolling Stone years ago, called Interstate Crosscheck. It knocked off nearly 1 million voters of color. Indivisible Illinois and Rainbow Push, and then the ACLU. We got that program killed. We stopped that Jim Crow purge program. Now they got this new one, the vigilante challenges, the attack on mailed-in ballots. I was talking in Savannah with a guy named Adrian Consinari, a young African-American in school. Someone challenged his signature so they wouldn't count his vote. They said, well, all you have to do is come in and show us some more ID. He says, I'm an 8-hour drive away, and I'm in the middle of my finals. They know what they're doing. They know who you are, how you vote. And in the southern states, they still have, like Georgia and Florida and others, still list your race next to your vote. They know who they're going after.
Would the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, if that were ever passed, would that correct some of this, Greg?
Oh, absolutely. That would be a huge thing. In fact, actually, Reverend Jackson, his wonderful daughter, Santita, said that they met with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris a few weeks before the election in Washington and said, here's Greg's film. They all know me. You got to look at Greg's film, but you got to do something about it, about these vigilante challenges. And all they got from Harris and Biden, well, when she gets elected, she'll sign the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Well, baby, my good friend, you're not going to get elected unless you stop it before the elections. And they found that out. So passing new voting rights legislation, I'm worried that we will have voting wrongs legislation. I'm afraid that these challenges will be put into the federal law. I'm afraid that this massive attack on the voter rolls, if we had 4.7 million voters purged in the year before this past election, get ready for what's coming next.
Well, and I'm also wondering, some of the data that you've been using to make these cases, one of the things that the Trump administration was famous for in their first go-round was removing any kind of data collection, first of all, from the website, second of all, from even being done. Remember how he wanted to mess around with the census? Yes. I wonder if the data you need going forward is even going to be available to you.
It's going to be an ugly fight, Joan. The NAACP had to go to court to get me some of this data, and we had to go to get a federal judge, to release some of this data. What other nation on the planet that considers itself a democracy doesn't tell you how many votes have been thrown away, doesn't tell you how many people have been removed? And so unfortunately, I'll bet you dollars to donuts that the Elections Assistance Commission is completely finished, and they will not get won't get the data from the states because it's not required by law. This is voluntary, and they're not going to release the data. Forget about it. And if you think studies like when the U.S. Civil Rights Commission says your chance of losing your ballot on picayune grounds is 900% higher if you're black than if you're white, do you think that's just going to go right? They're going to say, oh, that's DEI stuff. Ugh. No, it's exposing. It's exposing one of the most dangerous things that's happening in America, which is taking away our democracy. We're not going to see Trump call off the next election. I think people have that wrong. They're just going to make it so that right now that I was mentioning that this Jim Crow factor of 3.565 million votes, that's 2.3% of the vote. They don't need to push much more, especially in our electoral college system, the way our Constitution is set up. And it's going to get – I'm just concerned that the 2.3% is going to become 4.3%, and then it's impossible to overcome this Jim Crow factor. However, keep in mind that when Martin Luther King crossed that bridge at Selma in 1965, there weren't many black people who had the right to vote in the South or had the vote, and yet we overcame. We shall overcome. That's the direction, as he said, the arc of history bends towards justice, but people forget the other part of his phrasing, which is, but we got to bend it.
It also bends very slowly. Greg Palast, thank you for the work you're doing. Please join us regularly to update us on this. Because, we are a bunch of activists who listen to this station, and we're ready to get out there and fight. Thank you so much for your time.
See you at gregpalast.com, and I'll be in Chicago in a couple of weeks.
Wonderful.